Today we're talking about Matt Walsh and his super offensive thing he said about teen pregnancy and marriage. That was taken by some people to mean that he was trying to advocate for child brides. And it was from a long time ago, and it was, I think, being used as a way to misrepresent him and things like that. But, yeah, I heard the clip, and we can play that now.
It is not. In fact, ever since the beginning of time, teenage girls have been getting pregnant. It used to be more common. The peak, ever since they started keeping records of these things, which they only started doing recently, like in the 20th century, but ever since they started keeping records, in 1957 was the peak for teenage pregnancy. 1957. Not 2009,
well, back
not
then,
today.
All of them were supposed to have kids. Like, that's when you had kids.
That's my point, okay? So to all of a sudden act like this phenomenon of girls getting pregnant at a young age that we consider young, 16 or 17, to act like it's a new thing is ridiculous. It's always been that way. Even biologically, and this is me just stating, right now I'm going to start by just stating facts. So fact number one, it's not a new phenomenon. Fact number two, in fact, it's a phenomenon that was more common earlier in history, and for, the first 6,000 to 10,000 years of human existence, it was a normal thing. Fact three, girls between the ages of like 17 and 24 is when they're technically most fertile.
Yeah.
Okay? That's biological. That's a fact, all right? I'm just stating facts. That's all I'm doing. But what happened recently, and this is the fourth fact, recently in the last 30 years or so, we decided that that's way too young to start a family.
Why?
And because now
divorce rates would probably go up, and once you're that young, you can't really make sure that you know.
No, girls are no.
Because girls were getting married early, and marriages were lasting longer. You very rarely hear about like these relationships that go to their your diamond anniversary, your 50th anniversary, and all this. That's a dying breed of people out there.
Yeah, and those were all people that got married very young. That's why
they're still alive.
Yeah, that's why you can have someone in their 70s who's celebrating their 55th wedding anniversary because they got married when they were teenagers. So what I'm saying is that the problem is not per se teenage pregnancy; it's unwed pregnancy. That's the problem in society. It's only problematic when you are not married and you don't have the man there to help you take care of the kids because he's a coward. And the reason why we have that now are for two reasons. Because we have in current society, we live in the age of extended adolescence.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to preface this by saying I don't know that he still feels that way.
Yeah.
He kind of clarified his position on it. I still didn't feel like it was a total rejection of the premise. That teen pregnancy is okay so long as you're married, basically, was the premise. Like, obviously paraphrasing, but that's kind of what it comes down to. I don't know 100% if he still feels that way. I don't know that he would feel that way about his kids. But obviously, that is not true.
Right.
I mean,
he argued that the health of a marriage, for one, was determined by its length. And then also that teen pregnancy wasn't really a problem in the past because teens were getting married. And that in the context of marriage, it doesn't matter what age you're becoming pregnant. All that matters is that you're in a marriage.
Yeah.
And that's obviously does not bear out with the data or with people's experiences.
Also, I do want to point out that he didn't clarify, like, what age teen. No. He just said teen pregnancy, which a 13-year-old being pregnant, marrying, like, another, like one of their peers, or even, like, an 18-year-old, which is, like,
13
disgusting.
and 18 is
it's,
a
like,
huge
not...
difference.
Like, whoa, that's never okay. I don't care if somebody's married. I don't care if, like, they're the most mature, quote-unquote, teens. Like, in the world, there's no way in which that's, like, healthy.
No.
Like, no. And I've heard, like, pro-child consent pedophile arguments that, like, that teens are so much more intelligent than you give them credit for, and they're so much more mature, and they can handle so many things, and like, yeah, women gave birth when they were 13, that was totally okay, and blah blah blah. No. Just because it did happen at one point doesn't mean it's okay.
Right.
Like,
because you can explain why those certain things happened in the past.
Yeah.
For instance, like the fact that in the past societies were far more agricultural, things moved faster, you had to take up responsibility much faster. But that doesn't mean that teen pregnancy during that time was okay or healthy for the kids.
And I also want to point out that just because you kind of had to grow up faster and accept responsibility faster, it doesn't mean that that was healthy for someone's development either. That can emotionally stunt people and neurologically stunt people. So, yeah, I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but it can.
Right. That's the pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah. And besides, like, people's brain development, the way the brain develops, it hasn't really changed in the past, 100,000, tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
I mean, our brains still take until about 25, 26 to mature completely. And just because they're having teen pregnancies more often in the past doesn't mean their brains were fully developed then, even though they were taking more responsibility.
Yeah.
So.
Like, again, just because it happened in the past with regularity or traditionally or whatever does not mean that it was healthy. Like, people prescribed cocaine to each other, traditionally. Like, women also didn't think there was anything wrong with putting radium on their eyes as makeup. Like, these are, like, people will do a thing and then find out, oh, whoops, that was like super not healthy. And we learn from that, and that's how we build on society and establish, like, healthy practices and things like that that we try to pass on.
Right.
So yeah, I certainly hope that he isn't telling his teens that it's okay to get pregnant as long as they're married.
I know for a fact that it seems like he would be the type of person who would be like, you have to be very conservative, and he wants his daughters, I bet, to wait to find somebody to even date
his son,
until they're much older.
I would hope that it's not just
exactly. It should be both sexes.
Yeah, if you're going to advise that in girls, you should also advise in boys.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you're going to end up with a pretty lopsided population.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And it's a form of sexism that way too. That a double standard that you should be applying to both.
And again, not trying to assume his thoughts on it. He hasn't super clarified. I don't know that he necessarily needs to. People can say what they want to say, but what we're doing is just establishing why that particular statement is problematic and factually inaccurate.
Right. We want to clarify what he's saying with evidence and data, and also experiences to show that those specific claims he's making, that teen pregnancy was healthy or okay in the past, how that's not true. So we have data on neurological development, psychological development. We have data on the effects of teen pregnancy biologically on the mother's health and also on the child's health, and in terms of their psychological development, their biological development, and their social skills, going on and on and on. So it's important to explore that, and we can talk about that in detail. Yeah.
So I guess let's just jump into it and start by going over the neurological development.
So first of all, the human brain is not fully developed until the age of 25 or 26. And that's a big problem, first of all, for teen pregnancy, because as a teen mother or even a teen father, your brain is not fully mature, and there's going to be emotional and cognitive processing skills that aren't there yet, and that aren't as strong as an adult, as a mature adult. And so because of that, you're not necessarily ready psychologically or neurologically to take care of a child, because you're putting them at a higher risk of developmental issues and even higher risk of stress to yourself and to your life.
Like, it's hard to help someone grow when you're still growing.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and still trying to live your life, still trying to find your path in life and understand yourself.
Especially in relationships, I feel like there's a conservative argument that kind of pushes, like, getting married young and finding your partner as early as possible and that kind of thing. And, oh, well, you'll grow together. And we infantilize people by, you know, making them wait until they're, like, in their mid-20s until they start getting serious and whatever. But you spend your entire childhood up until you're 18, essentially. Like, getting to be a kid and exploring the world of being a kid and growing up that way. You get to 18... and then you're thrust into the world of adulthood. You have to learn about taxes and being able to sustain yourself and, like, cooking for yourself, hopefully, and cleaning up after yourself again, hopefully. So, and just self-care in general. And I hate that term so much, but
self-care
because it's so overused and, like, it's just, but no, really, self-care, like, people start figuring out their own patterns for, like, showering and stuff like that. I don't know how you grew up, but, like, my family was super strict about, like, being on their schedule for, oh no, you have to shower this many times a day. You have to, like, you know, constantly have this state of, like, presentability and whatever. And so it, I never had my own schedule to figure out. And maybe, you know, it's healthy to, well, no, I think it is healthy to start instilling that in your kids, that level of, like, self-sufficiency and self-care and stuff like that, and learning about these adult things. But really, you don't truly get thrust out into it on your own and are expected to do it all on your own until you hit 18. So I think waiting until you're, like, mid-20s to be like, okay, I think I'm finally ready to settle down and start figuring things out and, you know, plant some roots and whatever, is a bad thing. Like, I think that's good. I think that's great. Yeah. Like, I don't think it's infantilizing anybody. I think it's giving them space to just kind of figure themselves out. Because you bring somebody in who has no idea what they're doing and is trying to navigate all this stuff into a relationship with somebody else doing the same thing, or maybe they're a little bit more figured out, they're going to clash and fight and everything else. That's not really conducive to growing together. That can cause a lot of stress and kind of prolong that period of figuring things out and make things like financial stability and everything else take longer.
Yeah, that independence is a process throughout your teenage years, and it should be, like you said, instilled by the parent. As the child is growing up, you should be slowly instilling that sense of independence and exposing your child to things where they can become independent and learn tasks. And then the cat's going crazy.
She picked now. She picked now to have the zoomies.
But yeah, so it's a process. And as a teenager, that's a big time where you're learning even more responsibilities and more important tasks in your life. And you're developing your sense of self psychologically. It takes time to develop your sense of self and that self-identity and knowing who you are, knowing your interests in life. And even adults don't fully know. It might take your whole life to fully develop that, but especially during the teenage years.
There's like a stopping point.
Yeah, there's a stopping point. Hopefully.
Yeah.
You know, you shouldn't be like Peter Pan.
Right, yeah.
in your adulthood. But yeah, there is this process, and when you're bringing a child into the middle of this process that you're still developing your sense of identity, there's not a lot of room to help this child grow and develop and be there for them 100%.
No.
And we're not saying that it is this way 100% of the time, but it is a pattern that happens. Yeah. And it's important to be aware of, and it is an argument for being cautious and not having a child while you're a teenager.
And in my experience, the people that I've met, this is pretty common just in early 20s anyway. There's a lot of insecurity in people in their early 20s. I feel like, even traditionally, I feel like that's true. My grandparents are a prime example of that. And I feel like when you don't get to, like, deal with that, you pass so much of that on to your kids. Because they are watching you and trying to figure out how to succeed in life and what is okay and what isn't okay and what's acceptable and this and that. So when they're seeing you feel unsure and insecure about things or yourself or whatever, they're also going to feel that way, and they're not going to feel 100% safe, like, coming forward and telling you things, and especially not things that they're insecure about.
Right.
And you might end up doing things like punishing them for silly little things that don't warrant it and stuff like that. So
there's a lot of unconscious things that you probably have not dealt with yet.
Yeah.
Emilia wants to join us. This is a Brett and Heather podcast with your cats.
I need it. Okay.
You can see Emilia is the softest cat in the world. If you felt her, you'd be like, wow, this is the softest animal I've ever felt.
Okay.
Okay, Emilia. There you go.
Right on.
There you go. It's okay. You can sit there with us.
She's so cute.
So, when it comes to psychological development, that is important. It's something that you have to make sure you're developed and you're ready, and you can give that strength and sense of self. You can help impart that into your child.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's good to wait until you're psychologically mature and then have kids, if possible.
Because kids emulate you.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
how you're your child's introduction into the world and into, like, how to succeed and survive in the world. They learn that stuff by watching you. And they will develop a lot of the same behaviors and things, especially early on, that you show them through your actions. So
they model a lot of actions, like, that they're watching.
Yeah, it's the whole sins of the father kind of argument. So, it's on that alone. It's like, hey, maybe just wait. Right.
Well, neurologically, media, it's my script. It's my notes. So neurologically, I wanted to touch on just a few important things with changes to the brain during your teenage years and into young adulthood. And there are certain changes in levels of neurotransmitters. And this results in important differences in cognition and emotional processing. So with changes in levels, there's changes in levels of dopamine and serotonin, and this makes teens more sensitive to stress. And they're also more likely to have issues with regulating mood and behavior. And they also, because of this sensitivity, it also creates a more sensitive reward system that can inhibit warning signals about risk. So this is where teens get their issues with risk-taking. They're less sensitive to that inhibition in warning signals about risk. So adolescent brains, because of that, have a much harder time separating cause and effect compared to adult brains. And that's where we see the issues with understanding long-term consequences. Yeah. It's much harder. I mean, just think of yourself when you were 15 compared to, like, 23. Think of the huge difference between your ability to understand long-term consequences, you know? Like, it's huge.
I'm honestly shocked I got through my teens as fast as I did end up getting murdered. What is it?
But in some sense, when you were in your teens, you were really still developing a sense of self and trying to understand yourself. And that was no time to have children.
No way.
Like, that you couldn't... Most people cannot handle that.
Although... Yeah. I do want to say that I did raise my siblings.
You did, yeah.
When I was in my teens. And no early 20s. And, this suddenly turned into, like, a talk show segment.
Yeah.
Where, like, the animal comes out and starts like trying to mess with everything. She has a fascination with water.
She does. Anything metal.
Yes. But yeah, I did raise them, and it was not easy, but the way that I did so was by just kind of shutting off like anything I thought might bring in like negatives into their life. So if I was upset, if I was emotional, if I was anxious or whatever, I tried to shut that off as much as possible, and just their needs came first.
Right.
And that was more like a survival thing, and I was already used to doing that because of like compartmentalizing from dealing with the trauma and everything that I had during that time. But was it healthy for me? No. Because I was like having to sacrifice so much of myself for them. And then in my 20s was when I finally got around to like dealing with everything.
Right.
When they weren't around as much because I had moved. But yeah, I mean, ultimately I think I couldn't have kept it up for very long. Like if they were living with me still after I moved, I don't know that I could have kept it up. Like I still had to have my time where like they had no idea that I was off like crying or anything like that.
Right.
And I had to be really careful about, crying when I lived there, because I didn't want them to see it and worry about me and all of that. And I mean, they even slept with me like in my bed because they were because of the stuff at home was just so bad that they didn't feel comfortable sleeping by themselves.
Right.
So, yeah, it's not a good situation.
No, it's not. Like, that's important that you notice that you had to create that separation and make sure that you weren't imparting issues onto them that you had to deal with yourself.
But I only knew to do that because my mom did not do that.
Right.
And so all of her issues, I was hyper aware of them as a kid. And that made me not feel like I could talk to her or anything. Right. So then when I had the opportunity to be a parent to them, I was like, well, I know what not to do as far as like that goes.
Right, yeah.
So.
Yeah, there's important psychological research which shows that, like we talked about, you have to have a strong sense of self. For one, having long-term committed relationships, first of all.
Yeah.
And then having that long-term committed relationship also then helps you raise children in an appropriate way. And having two partners is even better than having one. Having two partners who have a strong sense of self and who are fully developed in terms of their brain and who are there psychologically, like, that makes a world of difference with raising a child. And
a cat hair.
And
hold on.
Meteor's making a big show. Yeah.
I thought she was just saying that.
I love that. Hey, it's really candid. It's awesome. Meteor, you're gonna be a star.
I thought she would end up like, meowing or something. I didn't think she'd be like up here.
So let's move on to another aspect of issues or negative aspects of teen pregnancy, and that's the health and well-being of both the teen parents and their children. Right,
which we were already kind of covering.
Right, in terms of when it comes to actually pregnancy itself, there are higher amounts of complications both to the mother and to the child in teen pregnancy. So, for example, complications linked to pregnancy and childbirth are among the leading causes of death for girls between the ages of 15 and 19.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Because, again, I'm going to go back to, I feel like there is a conservative argument that, the sooner you can have a baby, the better.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we still have situations in which child brides are acceptable in the United States. But I met a girl in high school, my sophomore year, and she was 16, and she was set to be one of those child brides. She was going to go and get married to her dad's friend,
oh my God.
Who had known her since childhood. This man was in his 40s, and she was planning on having a child immediately. And her whole thing was, yeah, because I don't want to wait and be, too old to play with them and that kind of thing. And it's like, girl, you are 16. Like, even if you waited a couple years or like until your 20s, you wouldn't be too old to play with them. Like, but there's this idea that, oh, well, if I have them younger too, like, that'll be healthier for me, because the younger you are, the more like successful your pregnancy is likely to be. But it sounds like that's not true at all.
Right. And when it comes to like complications biologically, it really relates to a certain age range. So the younger you are, if you're below a certain age, like below 20s, then there's a higher risk of complications. If you're above like mid 30s, higher risk of complications. So there's a prime window within which it's best to have a child biologically that relates to the chances of complications.
Is there a reason for that?
So from what I saw, one aspect of age, specifically young age, is even things like psychological stress.
Oh,
so
really?
Psychological stress can cause miscarriage. It can increase the amount of stress hormones produced in the body. That can affect the fetus. It can also induce hypertension in the mother and the fetus. So high blood pressure, basically. It can affect fetal programming. It can affect the amount of time the fetus develops. So you might have a preterm birth due to psychological stress.
Wow.
And young girls, 15 to 19, for example, they are, if they're having a baby during that time, that's a lot of psychological stress.
Can confirm 15 to 19, lots of psychological stress.
So you add on the psychological stress of being a teen, but then you add on top of that, the psychological stress of having a baby while you're a teenager, while you're trying to figure out things in your life still. All of this, right? And so that contributes to it. Biologically, in terms of just pure biology and the complications that way in terms of the age, not really sure. That's something to be interesting to look into. But I know for a fact there are biological risks to having children much younger. In terms of like being a teenager. We know for a fact that if you're having a child when you're like 10, 11, which we see in some countries, where these children are raped.
Read a thread on that.
Yeah, and so their bodies aren't even large enough or developed enough to have a baby, that they have to have a C-section. And so those things, age is an important factor when it comes to infant mortality. There's also, so specifically the data says that neonatal death rate for women under age 20 is 8.8 per 1,000 live births, compared to 5.7 for all live births. So the death rate for infants is higher for women under the age of 20. So there's also, in terms of emotional distress, like we talked about, that can also cause fetal complications. When it comes to the effects of teen pregnancy on the fetus itself, the baby can have a difficulty acquiring cognitive and language skills.
Why would that be?
For one, it might be largely social, so they don't have the resources to help them learn correctly. They're not passing that on to their children correctly. Also, there might be biological factors in terms of the woman's age that's affecting the development of the fetus and the brain programming. But I think psychological distress plays a huge role. That can rewire the brain in a negative way. It can negatively impact their ability to learn language and to have social skills. So when it comes to teen parents and the effects on teen parents are less likely to engage in emotionally supportive and effective parenting. And that makes sense based on what we talked about.
Do you think it's harder for teens to empathize then? Like, just that part of the brain isn't super developed yet?
That might be part of it. I think teens sometimes can be more self-interested, as we see, than adults.
Definitely seeing that lately.
Yeah.
One trip to TikTok. And
yeah, exactly. You can see it everywhere on TikTok.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think that's a big impact of it too, that, you know, teens are less developed in those empath skills neurologically, on average. And also, teen parents, they also tend to have less knowledge about child development. Mm-hmm. They also have issues with like judging their child's ability to adapt and learn, right? So they have trouble with their child's dependence, but also independence. So the balance is kind of not calibrated properly. Knowing where your child should be independent at a certain age, and then knowing where your child should be dependent still at a certain age. Yeah. It's hard for teen parents to kind of judge that, which I think makes sense. Because they're, for one, still developing a lot.
Well, especially since I think that's hard for most parents to deal with and understand.
So when you add being a teenager to that and all the stuff we talked about already, that's a lot.
I was a nanny for years. So, like, I saw that all the time. Parents who had, 4 and 5-year-olds that didn't know how to wipe themselves in the bathroom, or ones who, again, 4 and 5-year-olds that they just thought, yeah, sure, they can just go walk over to a friend's house, down the street or whatever by themselves. That's not a problem. And it's like, what? Hold on.
And these are parents, what, in their 30s?
Yeah.
Yeah. Parents in their 30s.
Yeah. About 35 was the average age that I saw.
Yeah. So when it comes to averages, you increase that risk of those types of issues being a teenager.
Yeah.
And being a parent.
Yeah.
It's not to say that they're all that way.
Right.
In those situations, but it's just you're increasing the risk of those things, those issues occurring. So also, there's been good evidence that teen parents are more likely to engage in harsh parenting practices compared to adult parents, such as yelling and hitting, because they lack life experience. Right. They also lack coping skills for the stress and the things that their child is experiencing.
Yeah. I was way more reactive in my teens, and Jennifer, my oldest younger sibling, she got the brunt of that, my being reactive, because I started having to do things like change her diaper, watch her, feed her, everything when I was like 8. And she was still a baby. And so when I was like 12, and she was just, oh my gosh, she was so high energy and so crazy and just destructive and like drove everybody nuts. I didn't know how to handle that. The adults in my life didn't know how to handle that. So I was way more reactive and yelled at her a lot because I didn't know how else to like communicate to her that what she was doing was bad. Like, she would pick up scissors and throw them at people and whatever. And like, then I slowly started developing other means of things, because obviously the yelling wasn't working and it was just making things worse. So then it came to, okay, well, how do we change this behavior, and how do we, get her to listen and discipline her and everything properly? And that was all just stuff I had to come up with on the fly. Yeah. And so she saw that development in me. And sometimes I do feel bad that she saw that in me, because I don't think it was great for her development. And thankfully, because I changed, she did like end up feeling more comfortable and secure and things like that, and was able to tell me things in the future.
You mellowed out.
Yes, a lot. So where now I just laugh at most things that are like upsetting.
And on Twitter too.
Yeah.
We laugh a lot.
Like my brother, for example, he never saw me be reactive or like, you know, go off the handle or whatever, because at that point I had learned, okay, that's very upsetting, but I'm going to have to swallow that for now and just figure out something to do about it instead. And, like, handle the situation and talk about why we don't do that particular thing. And I always made sure, and again, because of what I learned with parenting Jennifer, I always made sure that if I was disciplining or reprimanding, I ended it with very loving, positive, like securing words and like sentiments and a hug. So, but I still was not like, you know, soft and ignored the fact that, you know, some things required like a punishment, like, you know, I'm taking your video game away for X amount of time or whatever.
That pause that you talked about where you're like taking a deep breath and you're thinking about what the kid said, and like that requires a lot of presence. Yeah. You got to like really be present in the moment, like aware of your thoughts, aware of the feelings that are happening, aware of those sensations, and take a deep breath and be like, okay, we're going to address it this way, right? And think rationally about it and have a measured hand, but don't go off to the point where you're like yelling at them and going crazy.
Like if you think something like them breaking something is worth yelling or getting that upset about, I hate to tell you, but their teens are really going to set you up. Yeah. Because sometimes you know, it's not just like they'll tell you something, but as a parent, you find stuff out about your kid that might be very alarming. Right. So
almost all parents do, I think, for the most part.
You know, I found out things about Jennifer when she was going through her teens, you know, how she was talking to some boyfriends or things like that. Or one time some boy told her that he was in the hospital dying, and if only she could just send him some nudes and he'd be able to, you know, just have some light in his life and get to see a naked girl before he died. This was a 14-year-old boy. So he's a little stinker.
Wow. As a parent, that would have like bothered me so deeply. I would have been so upset at the boy.
But also, you know, she was 14, 15, she talked in a certain way, obviously, like to people she was in relationships with or whatever. That was upsetting to me, even though I knew I had done the same thing at that age. Right. But like seeing it from someone, like a child that you raised, that you still in some ways see as a child, you know, like as that little kid, because they're still developing and you're seeing their development through and trying to guide them and everything. You love them. You want them to be healthy. And you remember those things weren't super healthy for you. Yeah. But, it freaks you out on a level I cannot describe to you.
I bet.
Like you feel so like panicked, and you're like, oh no, how do I stop this?
Like almost like, I don't know, like the world's crashing down or something around you.
Like, because you want to help, and you have to really stifle that part of you that's like, you know, wants to run over and like, no, like this is bad and this is why it's bad, and because they're not going to listen to you. No. They're going to think you're totally like insane. Because for one, they have to experience those things like themselves and go through those things to then learn it to where it sticks. Right. It's hard to kind of take to heart what the parent is saying without you yourself experiencing it. And I also didn't want to make her feel stupid and childish and whatever for going through a very normal thing that teenagers go through. You know, they have urges, they do things and whatever. And they're figuring that part of themselves out. So the key is that they're not being destructive in what they're doing. So you don't want to make them feel that way. Yeah. And it's also embarrassing, like, to know that someone found these things out about you or knows that you said these private things. So then you have to, again, like, swallow it and find, like, the perfect time to sit down and have a very realistic conversation and be super honest about your own stuff, too, and mistakes that you made or whatever. Right. So that they know you're not just... relate to you, maybe? Right, and you're human. Your kids, more than anything, want to know that you're human and that you're compassionate and you care about them and you're a safe person to come to.
Right.
You know, like, so being human with them on that level. I'm not saying do this whole thing where it's like, let me tell you about leather kinks. Like, no. Like,
no, that's,
right.
No.
But
there's an appropriate way of relating experiences
like,
or,
yeah, I understand what you're feeling right now. You may not think I do, but I, at your age, should, you know, whatever. And just know that you can talk to me, and if something doesn't feel right or you feel like you're pushing things too fast, and you might feel pressured to do that, but also a hesitance to do that, because that's a big thing teens go through, is like, especially teen girls, like, I want to be, you know, sexy or whatever, or like, I want to be attractive, but then also like, but maybe not so much as I'm getting too much attention, it's too fast.
Right.
So, yeah, you have to talk about all of that stuff with them and in a measured way that also doesn't make you sound like a total, like, you know, ancient boomer.
Yeah.
That doesn't get it, or brutish or whatever.
Right.
So, yeah, and I don't know that someone who was still trying to fight through all of that in their teens is going to do the best job of, you know, being there for their kid, because they never really learned that kind of like communication.
Yeah, like even I was, as a teen, I was pretty mellow and chilled out. But looking back, like, there was no way I would have had the presence of mind to be that person for a child. There's no way.
Yeah.
Like, I was reactive in certain ways, just like all other teenagers. I didn't have that presence of mind to be really aware of my thoughts and analyze my thoughts deeply. And as you grow older and as you get into your early 20s, you start to become more conscious of those things naturally. But yeah, it's just, I think for most people can say that during their teens, they were not psychologically ready.
I do also want to point out the big trigger for me to stop being reactive and to try to be more measured was because Jennifer pointed it out to me. I had yelled at her for something. And, it was just like this little screaming match back and forth between, like, you know, teenage me and tiny Jennifer. We're just, you know, yelling at each other. And then at one point she said something like, she didn't really know how to articulate it in any other way. But when I'd come home and I would be in parent mode, because I'd come home from school and then I'd have to parent her and everything and then start on homework, I'd put my hair up in a bun and, you know, do whatever because it would get in the way. And so she goes, whenever you have your hair like that, you're so mean and you just yell at me all the time. And I felt so bad. I was like, oh no. I don't want her to think I'm being mean to her. I don't want her to be afraid of, you know, interacting with me when I have a certain...
change your behavior?
So then I was like, oh God, like that's how she sees me. Like it was just a moment where I had that mirror, you know, like this is how someone is seeing me. This is how they're perceiving me. This is who I am to them in their life. Because, you know, you're reacting and you're experiencing life from your perspective, your window. And you know all your complex thoughts. You know you're not, you know, intending to be mean or whatever. And you're not thinking really about how you're, you know, the glimpses the other person gets of you, how they're interpreting you and who you are to them. So that's what that was. And so it was like, okay, I have to stop doing that. And that's what triggered that whole thing. It was not something that I feel like I would have developed until way later.
That was when you were a teenager?
Yeah. I was, oh gosh. I think I was 14. And yeah, because I think I had just started high school that year. And I had just learned how to do, like, the hair bun thing. And so...
And even then, it's hard to, like, understand how people see you at that age.
Yeah.
And so Jennifer almost kind of... I mean, it helped you in a way.
Right.
It helped
it
you become
helped
more
me
conscious
in a major way. She literally changed my life by saying that to me.
And that's kind of a positive thing about children is they can point out things to you that
and that might not
so
be
honest
something that every kid will think to do, but in that moment she was articulating as best she could her feelings about me and her perception of me. And like I was just like, oh my God, okay.
Like a glass shattering moment.
And it's that, what is it, the theory of mind? Like, I don't think teenagers really have that theory of mind developed. And so then, like that was so big. So if it hadn't been for her saying that to me, I would not have totally changed my parenting style, the way I deal with things in general. Like she kicked that off for me. And obviously she wasn't intending to. Like she was just a little kid who was angry at me and doing her best to tell me why. She like kind of
unlocked a piece of a psychological puzzle really for you.
Did. But yeah. So that, I mean, I think is a big one, is like teens don't realize that about themselves and can't really, people, have trouble with that. So of course teenagers are going to struggle with it. Yeah. And no one's pointing it out, when you're doing this with me, you are acting this way and this is how I perceive you. Right. They're never going to know to change that behavior. And a kid who has learned already that they can't communicate with that person is probably not going to tell them or be able to figure out how to tell this person those feelings. So
I think we can also, now that we covered a lot of issues related to teen pregnancy and the effects on the parents and the effects on the child, I think we can also talk about the second point that Matt Walsh was discussing, which is that the length of a marriage determines its health, and also that teen pregnancy, that within a marriage, that the marriage itself is a healthy thing, right?
Right.
And if we just look at the data of the health of teen marriages and how long they last, it's not good. So first, the divorce rate is much, much higher for teens who got married as teens compared to adults. And, for example, women who marry in their teens are 2/3 more likely to divorce within 15 years compared to women who get married as an adult. And that's obvious because you change a lot, like we discussed, as a teen going into adulthood, right? And when you're getting married with somebody as a teenager, you're not going to be in the same headspace as you are just in the next 6, 7, 8 years at all. So, and because those people got married without having a strong sense of self, most likely, without having strong coping skills, without having fully developed neurology, it makes perfect sense why there's a much higher divorce rate.
You're going right from being under your parents' roof and dealing with their stuff to now trying to accommodate your spouse while also trying to figure yourself out, which teens, like with each other, with their peers, do try to be more accommodating because they're, again, in that like teen survival mode of trying to figure out the world and whatever. And that kind of breeds resentment and everything else. Also, the length of a marriage does not determine itself. Like, my grandparents have been married, oh my gosh, I think for 50 years now. And it is not good. It's not a pretty picture. My grandmother like has to walk on eggshells around my grandfather. Like, he can barely do things for himself because of his various illnesses, but boy, he still has her under his thumb, and it is not pretty. My parents have been married for 34 years now, and they're living separately. And my father was a monster, and my mom isn't a super healthy person. So, that whole relationship I was married for over 10 years. And yeah, because I hadn't processed a lot of my stuff, again, I was just like, sure, no, it's your way all the time. And that led to its own problems. And obviously, I wasn't dealing with a lot of things in a healthy way either. And that wasn't great. So, no.
Yeah, there's this like cultural thing that he mentioned, which is, you know, in the past that marriages did last longer. And that's true, they did. But that's not an indicator of a healthy marriage.
No.
The only reason why more marriages lasted longer in the past, which is, for one, there was a culture of reinforcing the fact that you're not allowed to divorce. That it's a sin to divorce, that it's a bad thing to divorce. Which, I mean, in the context of if you're not really committing to your partners and you're just getting divorced all the time, that's different. But like divorcing for a reason of like an unhealthy relationship, right? But in the past, even if you were in an unhealthy marriage, there was no room for divorce. For the most part.
Well, and you also have to factor in a lot of these traditional marriages in the West, like these women were not really working. They were at home. And if they were, it was supplemental income typically. It wasn't income that they could sustain the same lifestyle and whatever, and they had kids and everything else. When you have kids together, it makes things so much more complicated. And like in my grandmother's case, like she didn't know what her husband would do with kids if they got divorced. Like my grandfather like can't even clean up after himself still. Like he's always been, you know, this grumbly like old codger that just like tracks dirt everywhere because he's always like out in the yard fixing like 50 different lawnmowers. But like
he does have a lawnmower.
he has a lawnmower addiction. It's a problem. But like he wouldn't be able to raise kids, but you know he'd be like, no, those are my kids, they're my property and whatever. So she's having to think about that. She worked, but not any jobs that would have been able to sustain her and kids. So yeah, just traditionally, it was not a situation in which women were able to really like leave a situation anyway. And then you adjust, which is what happened for me for a lot of my marriage, was just adjusting to, okay, well, I don't love these behaviors, but you know, considering what else is out there, like I think it's the best I'm gonna do, and I'm used to this, I might as well just stay, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, people can be within a marriage for a long, long time and put up with a lot, and that's not an indicator. The fact that they're staying is not an indicator of a healthy marriage. What matters is the quality of the marriage and the health of the relationship.
Right. You can be married for 5 years and have an amazing relationship, and then your partner passes away because you're like 80 and you finally found somebody. Like,
exactly.
But yeah, no, it's silly to assume that the length of a marriage makes it healthy inherently. That's a fallacy. Another
unhealthy thing with teen marriages is the fact that being married as a teen increases your risk of intimate partner violence. So sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. Women who are married as teens are at greater risk for physical and sexual intimate partner violence.
Do you think, again, that that's part of the theory of mind and the reactive nature of teens?
Yeah, I think it's a huge part of it. That's definitely a huge part of it. The fact that they have a more difficult time understanding the emotions and perspectives and thoughts of their partner, and combine that with, for instance, being a male and having a huge surge of testosterone that does increase aggression. It doesn't excuse what they're doing, but it is a partial or even a large factor. And so they have a hard time regulating that behavior, regulating and channeling that energy. And so that definitely, on average, increases those risks of these women who are married as teenagers experiencing intimate partner violence, especially from their male partners.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I had some pretty reactive and violent partners in my teens. And I hope they're better now. I don't know, because I don't keep tabs on my exes, but I hope they're better now. Yeah. I have to wonder how common that is.
It depends on the country for one. It depends on the culture.
Yeah.
And then, it depends on a lot of factors. But
in the book Why Gender Matters, they kind of go over this and
by Leonard Sachs, right? I think so. Yeah.
But particularly the sexual violence and how the teen boys are more like sexually aggressive and coercive, and the girls aren't really super into it, but they're doing it because they, going along with things because they don't want to like seem uncool or undesirable or anything. Which, if you're a teen girl, be undesirable, be uncool, and be like, no, you go take care of that on your own. You're better than that. They're lame. You're awesome. So
exactly, you gotta have a mentality of like, I don't care what you think. I'm gonna do my own thing.
Yes,
I don't need your approval. Like,
right, and that goes for teen boys too. Don't let anybody pressure you into anything. Like, that is not okay. That is not good behavior. And you know what? You're helping them too, because then they won't end up going into future relationships and hurting other people and getting into legal trouble and things like that. You tell them early, hey, no, that's not cool. Don't do that to people. And hopefully by the 50th time, they'll learn something and stop being that way. So yeah, don't ever be afraid to set a boundary and tell somebody no. That is super important.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
It's one of the most important things to learn as a teenager.
Yes.
You have to learn that as a teenager.
Learn your boundaries and enforce them in the most hardcore way possible. Yeah, like, do not let anybody run those over.
Yeah, absolutely. Because somebody might have preferences that you don't have, that you might not share the same preferences, and that's okay, but they cannot enforce their preferences onto you, especially ones that are really important and matter to you.
And if anybody tries to make you feel bad for enforcing those, like their friends or your friends or whatever, like, no, why is it okay for somebody to do that? It's not. It's stupid. It's lame and rapey and gross. Don't be a part of that.
Absolutely.
Like, people respect you more when you stand your ground that way. They really do. I know that sounds like some like after school special, but it's true. Like,
it is true.
Trust me. Like, be firm and don't let anybody like push you around that way or guilt you or anything. They're stupid for doing that, and they won't even remember it later. And but you're going to remember feeling super good about yourself and establishing those boundaries and keeping them up.
That brings up another thing with like raising children as a teenager. If you're not good at setting boundaries,
right?
If you're still learning how to set boundaries, how are you going to set boundaries for your child?
That's very true. Yeah.
And they have to learn boundaries as early as they're born. Like, they have to learn boundaries from, like, if they don't learn boundaries before they're 4, it's not good.
Yeah.
It's hard to come back from that.
There's always that, like, mean toddler at the playground who like throws stuff at other kids and takes their snack or whatever.
You didn't learn boundaries, did you?
Yeah. So just try to teach that to your kids as early as possible, and try to absorb that in yourself too. Like, don't let anybody erode your boundaries, no matter how old you are.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But ultimately, I think we've come around to like every point on this, and why teen pregnancy is not a super great idea, even if you're married. Yeah, both teen pregnancy and marriage as a teen is not healthy for the most part. Right. It does not result in great outcomes for the most part, based on the statistics and based on people's own experiences. So I think it's something that when we hear claims from people like Matt Walsh or anybody else who makes claims like that teen pregnancy within a marriage is healthy, well, just look at the data, think critically about it, and don't just accept every single thing that this pundit is saying. Right, just because you agree with him on some things, or you feel like he's a valuable voice in some regards, like on some topics, it doesn't mean that you have to just like be like, like with everything, because this is obviously like ooh. So,
yeah.
And and for somebody to disagree and say that kids can't consent to things like medical transition and things like that, which I agree with him on, for him to imply that teens can consent to pregnancy and marriage and everything else, it's like,
yeah, that's a huge contradiction in logic that I don't see how you can really make them come together, because
you can't rationalize
that together. That just doesn't work. Saying that gender affirming surgeries, they can't consent to that, but then they can consent to teen pregnancy and marriage.
And again, I'm not saying he still feels this way. This is something he said, I think, when he was in his 20s.
Yeah, in his 20s, during like a podcast that he was on with a few people.
And he has since changed a lot of his views since then, according to him, including his views on having kids himself.
Yeah.
So, I'm not going to assume he still feels that way, but just responding to his comments from that time, that's where we're
And we support Matt Walsh's fight against gender ideology. We support that fight against the mutilation and sterilization of children. But we can also point out areas where Matt Walsh is incorrect or other pundits are incorrect, and we don't have a problem doing that at all. So it's important to. You don't have to.
Loyalty here.
Yeah, you do not have to. In fact, we recommend you do not be, 100% loyal to one person. It's about critically analyzing and thinking about their perspectives. You don't have to agree with 100% of what they say to support the causes that they support. So.
Yeah. So that wraps it up, and we can talk about a tiny joy, which we don't have prepared.
No, but we'll get it. We'll find one right out here in the wild.
Oh, I do have a tiny joy, actually. So the tiny joy...
How tiny is it?
The tiny joy is actually, really awesome. So I don't know if anybody knows about the Fauci beagles, the beagles that were abused during his science experiments, which was horrible. But they went up for adoption from rescue groups around the country, and they were all adopted. So much so that people are on waiting lists for the beagles and everything. So they're all going to get great homes. And that's...
Hundreds of beagles or thousands? How much was it?
I forget. I will put that up there. I am so sorry, because I'm just remembering this off the top of my head. But yeah, so they got adopted, and that's really exciting and awesome, wonderful. Yeah. And I really hope all those dogs end up super fat and happy. Obviously not fat in an unhealthy way, but
satisfied.
Yes. Fat in the emotional sense. Fat with love.
Yeah.
But yeah, just really healthy and happy and loved, and get to take so many naps.
We're not going to repeat. We're not going to repeat what Fauci.
I'd rather not.
Helped
horrible.
Do and on to these dogs.
If you want to look that up, I don't recommend it. It's nightmare fuel. I know I'm probably not helping. This is probably just making you more curious.
But just know that the fact that they have been adopted, all of them, is huge and very noteworthy. So that's why it's a tiny joy of the day.
Especially considering there are so many dogs out there that are abused, that need homes and everything, and just to see these dogs not be stigmatized and instead be embraced and loved, and just have so many people wanting to help them is really beautiful. Yeah. So yes, that's more of a big joy, but yeah.
I love that.
So thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching, guys. And stay tuned for our next podcast,
which hopefully will come a lot sooner.
Yep. Bye.